All right. Hello. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. As many of you may have noticed, we have switched to a new platform for podcasting, so it is very likely that we might get some technical difficulties that we might have to work through during this broadcast. So if that is the case, just bear with us, and we are working on it here. But I am pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, who is an advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a top overview of the current events happening in Israel for the week. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session from the audience. And if you would like to ask a question, you can either use the Q&A feature located in your broadcast, or you can use the chat function inside of the YouTube live stream. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Ahnaf, and good evening from Israel. I hope you can hear me loud enough. I know that, as Ahnaf said, there could be some kinks, one of which, as you can see, there's no usual logo. I am filming from my safe room, even though we kind of have been allowed now to go back to something close or completely to normalcy, whatever that means in Israel these days. But this room pretty much for the last 2 weeks has been the safe room with beds, with everything that you could need for the possibility, which we always thought at the beginning of the war, even from Hezbollah, that we could spend hours, maybe even days in this room. But thankfully it hasn't happened, and it doesn't seem like it will happen for now. But obviously it's been quite a week. I'm not going to go over every single thing that happened this week. I'm just going to rather talk about the end of what Israel called Operation Rising Lion, which was, most people will call the Iran-Israel war. And despite the strange or sort of messy ending, there was that whole thing with President Trump calling off the Israeli fighters after Iran had broken the ceasefire by at least 3 hours. And even as we saw President Trump, as he likes to do, go ad lib a little bit, drop the F-bomb, as they call it, towards Iran and Israel. But none of that should dampen the fact that it was an extraordinary 12 days, an extraordinary operation by the IDF, the Israel Air Force, obviously in particular, although now the Chief of Staff has laid out that there were commandos, there were actual ground troops on the ground during the operation. That has now come out over the last couple of hours. So it wasn't just the Israel Air Force, and we obviously have to recognize the role of the Mossad, which gave such precise and incredible intelligence and even led the battle from on the ground. And really, the Israeli government feels that, and the Israeli defense establishment feels that the operation went better than all expectations. The fact is that Israel was always a few days ahead of schedule. They did not believe that even on that first night things would go so well. That's why they called everybody in the whole country immediately into their safe rooms, because they believed there would be an immediate reaction from Iran, which there wasn't, because the people who would need to do it were taken out. The ballistic missiles, many of them were taken out, and it was really almost perfect. As I said, one has to ask a question: when was the last war that lasted 12 days with such two enormous foes, where on one side not a single military personnel was killed? I don't remember such a thing. And although the loss in civilian life in Israel was high, it was I think it was 30 in the end, it really was far less than anyone had even thought was the lower end of probability in such a war, certainly on the Israel side. In Israel, we like to debate everything, and one of the big debates is, what is this so-called 12-day war, as President Trump liked to call it? What is it most like? Was it like the 67, the stunning 6-day victory where they took out however many armies in 6 days and everything like that? Was it the 73 war, which, if you go back to October 7th, started very badly, but in the end there was an amazing victory? But there are those who say, and to a certain extent they might be right, it's actually more like 56, the Suez crisis, where Israel, along with, at that time, allies, Britain and France, were making tremendous inroads in the Sinai against the Egyptian army until the Americans decided that was enough. And a lot of analysts and historians have said that that was the moment the sort of empires of Britain and France really were ended, and that's the time where America became a superpower. And what we certainly saw this week is America is still the superpower. When it says something, very few like to argue. We saw Israel basically agreeing to what President Trump wanted. We saw Iran agreeing to what President Trump wanted, and they were so scared of him that, again, according to President Trump, but again, you can see the results for themselves, that he was given such a heads up for the attack on the American Air Force base in Qatar that they had hours to get everything out, and it was really a relatively performative act, and everyone knew what was going to happen, and there was never really any great danger. But the fact remains is that towards the end, as I said, Israel had attacked all of its targets, the bank of targets it had at the beginning of the war, well ahead of schedule. They were victims to a certain extent of their own success. And then we're attacking things like the Basij headquarters, Evian prison, and various other targets that were never in their bank of targets, were not really associated with the goals of the war to stop the Iranian nuclear program, or at least push back the imminency of it. The same with the ballistic program. So the fact that they were targeting other things, again, just showed that they were sort of, they were just so ahead of schedule. So the messages started getting through that Israel was sort of done. The Iranians were done very early. They wanted to call for a ceasefire. They were sending messages from the first or second day to their allies in the region, to Qatar, to Oman, to try and get a message across to the Americans. It really was a very effective operation. Again, the end did leave a bit of a sour taste in the mouth for some, especially in Israel, and especially on the sort of right-wing coalition supporters of Prime Minister Netanyahu. A poll was put out and said that there was far more positive feeling about the end of the war in the general public, and certainly in the opposition centrist elements, than there was on the right wing. But again, I think many people understood that Israel had achieved a large part of what it wanted to do. As far as that, we really don't know what the results will mean, really, until the passage of time. There's talk tonight that Israel probably pushed back, with the help of America, obviously, 2.5 to 3 years, the nuclear program. It's very unclear. I don't know if anybody, we've all seen those reports on CNN and New York Times that really only put back the nuclear program by weeks. That was based on a very immediate US intelligence that was considered with low confidence. In other words, they had no actual access to what was going on the ground. They just tried to guesstimate something, but that made a lot of news. The messages coming up from the Americans were many years. Israel certainly does not want to go against what President Trump said, especially at the NATO meeting today. But there's a feeling it's around 2.5 to 3 years, perhaps more. We don't know yet. And that's really where we've got to accept that at this point, we don't know how far it's back, because we do know that there is around 450 kilograms of uranium somewhere in Iran. There are reports that we knew where it was, but perhaps we didn't want to take it out because of the radiation, because of the problems involved in doing something like that. But the whole debate is, what can you do with that? If you've taken out the knowledge to a certain extent, then it becomes more difficult to do anything with that 60% enriched uranium. If you've taken out many of the centrifuges, then it can't be enriched to weapons grade, which is around 90%, and various other things. So just having highly enriched uranium in of itself is not enough. There is a risk always of these types of things, that you can make a dirty bomb, something which is not attached to a missile, but perhaps can be driven. Apparently again, I'm not an expert in this, 400 kilos of uranium is very heavy, but it's not that large a quantity. So there is always that worry that it could be driven across the Allenby crossing between Jordan and Israel at one point and set off. But I think that's a low probability. Israel has shown that it has very high intelligence, so the likelihood of that is very small. So again, probably we'll only get the true idea of what Israel actually achieved really in the months and years ahead. We'll see whether Iran are desperate for an agreement, whether Iran move back towards enrichment, because a lot of it has to do with deterrence. Even if Israel only did just put it back months or even years, what it did show to Iran is we can get to you at any point. We can get to you without barely a scratch on us. And yes, it might be harmful and damaging to the home front, but we can pretty much take out your air defenses, we can take out your centrifuges, and with this American president who thankfully today laid bare on the table that the military option is not off the table. It still remains there, and if necessary, it could be used again. What we've also got to keep in mind is when we think, okay, we did all of this just for 2 or 3 years. Should remember in 1981 when Israel attacked Iraq and Iraq, there were not obviously the same naysayers, but the same type of naysayers who said, well, they'll just rebuild it in a very short amount of time. It will only take 2 years for Saddam Hussein to rebuild his nuclear weapons capability. And in fact, he never did. And largely simply because of the deterrence. Was it worth it? Don't forget, Iran has taken decades, 4 decades, 5 decades to build their nuclear weapons capability or something close to it, because they thankfully never reached it. And it cost them tens of billions of dollars. Some say even more. Some say hundreds of billions of dollars over the years. So do they want to do that all again? And Israel in a few days can knock the whole thing out. That all remains to be seen. And those are the kind of things that we're going to be looking for. The effect on the last front, the last real front at this point, on Gaza, it remains to be seen. The US is very optimistic that it is having an effect and that we can come to an agreement pretty soon. Israel sees the opposite. It sees that there's no effect on Hamas coming closer to a deal. And in fact, I'm not as optimistic as the US. There is an offer beyond the Witkoff proposal before, or at least something that's being talked about, that Hamas would give up some sort of symbolic weapons disarmament at some level. Some of their leaders would go into exile. But the sticking point seems to be, all of this obviously for an end of war and return of the Israeli hostages, but the sticking point seems to be again what that looks like on the day after. Would Israel remain on the Philadelphia corridor, that all-important corridor between Gaza and Egypt? Israel is saying that it absolutely must, and Hamas wants Israel out to the last inch. There is talk that if they could get something together in the next few days, next few weeks, perhaps it can also be tied into some sort of movement towards normalization with Saudi Arabia. This is the grand plan that's always been talked about, where everything can sort of be tied up. Netanyahu himself is not a big fan at the moment. He's not optimistic about things going forward. He's still very much trying to see the Witkoff proposal as the direction they should be heading. But there are many others in the cabinet who believe it's now time to stop the war. This surge into Gaza that started a few months ago is achieving results, but it's not really changing on the ground. Yes, Israel's taking more and more territory. Yes, Israel is fighting Hamas and killing Hamas, but it's also costing us in a lot of bloodshed, and we lost 7 young soldiers the night before last. It was only released yesterday. And this is taking its toll, and a lot of people are asking, is it worth it? So the question on the table for the government tonight is really either change things in a concerted way, try and fight the war differently, try and get it over in a more emphatic way, or just go to the deal. There are different voices in the government calling for both, and we'll see which one wins out in the days and weeks ahead. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Now, to address the audio issues here, we're working on it, and we're figuring out this new platform here on Riverside. But for those in the audience, I will be editing this broadcast and boosting Ashley's audio here. That should be uploaded to our YouTube and our social media channels this evening. But just to get to some questions here from the audience now, I will start with one from Carrie, who asks, we're getting contradictory and confusing messages about the extent of damage to the Fordo and Isfahan underground enrichment sites, as well as the quantity and accessibility of enriched uranium that the regime possesses. What is your take?
Anyone who tries to give a definitive answer at this point is either doesn't know what they're talking about or is probably pushing for a particular agenda one way or another. Quite simply, we don't know at this point exactly the damage. President Trump did let in on some details, and he said Israel has checked it on the ground, not just alluding, but basically saying that Israel's assets, Israel, maybe even spies, are there and have actually been able to verify that a lot of damage was done. And that's certainly what the Israelis are feeling, and now that's what the Americans are feeling. Even the IAEA has suggested that probably there is a lot of damage. How much, we don't know. At the moment, the Iranians are not approaching Fordo, which might speak to the fact that they also may not think that there's much that they could do, certainly not at this point. So it's impossible to know. We won't know at this point in time, one way or another. Any reports you read in the New York Times, in CNN, or pretty much elsewhere are probably just guesstimates, probably have very little validity, but probably probably in the next few days, maximum week or two, we will probably have a more definitive answer. But it seems one way or another that Fordo was damaged. To what extent, as I said, we don't know fully yet.
Now, Jay would like to ask, did Israel really achieve their objectives like Netanyahu says, or was he forced into a ceasefire prematurely by President Trump? And in light of that, does Israel regret not killing Khamenei when it had the chance?
As I said, Israel, by the end of the war, it had achieved everything that it set out to. It went through its bank of targets. It had full air supremacy, and it was bombing targets that certainly were not related to the goals of the war. As I said, the Basij, the prison, and other, sort of more civilian targets, or not necessarily civilian, but not necessarily related to the ballistic and the nuclear issues, which were the primary goals of this war. So Israel couldn't, economically, socially, militarily, can't go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. It is a long distance to fly. The fact that every single time it seemed to go off without a hitch, and the fact that every single Israeli pilot came back safe and sound every single time. The worst nightmare for Israel would have been having one of its planes shot down over Iran, and the pilot and co-pilot ejecting and then being kidnapped. One could only imagine what that would have done, and the longer it went on, the greater the chance would have been. So the Israeli government was relatively happy to go for a ceasefire. The way it happened in the end with those final moments, not necessarily. There was a bit of a craziness, as I said, who was to shoot last, who was allowed to shoot last, who was to be blamed. Again, let's not pour over that too much, but Israel was quite happy for the ceasefire. But again, it all remains to be seen what happens next. If President Trump is true to his word, any new attempt to move towards nuclear weapons capability, either with enrichment or ballistic program, hopefully will be met by a further military response if necessary. That's very important. But Israel certainly achieved exactly what it wanted as it set out on this operation, and as I said, and more. As far as Ayatollah Khamenei, there were talks. It certainly was brought up a number of times in the Israeli defense establishment. There were voices for and against. Some felt that would be symbolic, and maybe the Iranian people would rally round after that. There are even those, and I think I said this last week, or at least hinted at it, there were voices who were saying that the Ayatollah had made so many mistakes from the beginning, not understanding Donald Trump, not coming to negotiating table in a serious way, not understanding that Israel was about to attack, not understanding America was about to attack. The fact that he made mistake after mistake, many actually thought maybe he's an asset staying where he is. So don't take him out because he's really running this war so badly. It's better to keep him in. And again, I want to say that at no point was it official Israeli policy to move towards regime change. There's been a constant narrative within Israel. Regime change is up to the Iranians. Yes, some of the symbols of oppression were hit. As I said, the Basij, which is a sort of local oppressive domestic police service, the Evin prison, which is where political dissenters are put. And in fact, we see Iran really using the excuse of going after so-called Mossad collaborators by trying to kill as many of opposition figures as possible. So they're obviously quite worried about that, and they want to reassert their power, because they took quite a hit regardless of the fact that they had this whole victory rally yesterday in Tehran. They understand what happened. Deep down, yes, they are fanatical, but they also understood that they took a great big hit, and they understand that it made them look weak in the eyes of a significant percentage of the public, which anyway probably doesn't like them. So they really need, in the coming days more than anything else, is to reassert themselves violently, oppressively. But again, Israel never made it a stated, open, explicit goal for regime change. I'm sure, if maybe not every single moment, they certainly knew where the Ayatollah was at various times. They could have taken him out, and simply the decision was made, perhaps with pressure from the Americans, perhaps pressure from elsewhere, but the decision was never made to target him.
Thank you. Now, Jose would like to ask, should the 5+1 agreement that limited the capacity of Iran uranium production been not abandoned by the U.S., would this bombing have been necessary?
It's a good question. It's impossible to know. But what we do know is Iran never really kept to what was in the agreement. And also, Israel felt that the JCPOA agreement from the beginning was flawed. The fact is, it was never permanent. It had a sunlight clause. I think it was after 10 years. So perhaps today we would be almost in the same situation. Perhaps if not today, perhaps in a year time, maybe even a little bit longer. But there was a certain set of conditions that perhaps wouldn't be there if the JCPOA, Hezbollah would have been still in power. Hamas may not have tried October 7th, and all these assets for the Iranian regime. And let's not forget that we found many documents that spoke to the fact that October 7th, Hamas, Hezbollah, this was all meant to be coordinated. It was meant to be the grand plan, as the Iranians called it, for the annihilation of Israel. And let's not forget, when they say the annihilation of Israel, death to Israel, it's not just theoretical, it's not a slogan, it's policy. The Iranian parliament passed a law which said that one of the objectives of the Islamic Revolution, in other words, one of the objectives of the Islamic Republic itself, was to destroy Israel. They had a big clock in Tehran which had a countdown to the destruction of Israel. I can't remember if it's 2040 or 2041, because that's when Ayatollah Khamenei said that Israel will be destroyed. So it wasn't just a theory, it was very much part of their policy. So what Israel was able to achieve, not just in the last 12 days, but in the last year and a half, basically taking out almost the whole proxies, whether in Syria, whether in Lebanon, even the Houthis, we haven't heard anything from them. I'm sure at some point they may well shoot a missile, but they're not the greatest threat. Hamas, Islamic Jihad. Israel is in a very good place, strategically, defensively, security-wise. And if things go well over the next few months, it could be arguably the best situation it's ever been since the re-establishment of the Jewish state in 1948.
Thank you. Now, Charlotte would like to ask, how much does all of this intensify Iran's desire for a nuclear weapon for the sake of deterrence?
It's a good question, and it all depends how fanatical the regime is or how blind it is. We've seen a lot of blindness. There is this belief that Israel will be destroyed. it's really a foundational belief. It's not something on the side. They really do believe that it's going to happen, and they just have to make it happen. If they believe no matter what, Allah will give them this prize, and they just have to do whatever's necessary, then perhaps they will restart it. But there are always more pragmatic elements who understand that Israel could be back. And do you really want Israel back with its complete freedom of navigation in the air, able to target whatever it wants, whenever it wants, able to, destroy whatever the Iranians move forward? Because one thing is clear: Israel knew exactly what was going on almost in every single corner of the Islamic Republic, and it was able to get to wherever it wanted. It was able to get to the highest levels. It was able to kill, I think, 3 chief of staffs, one after the other, almost a dozen scientists, many other leaders of the Iranian military, its air force, its ballistic missiles, its launchers, everything. So are they crazy? Do they have this irrational belief? Perhaps. But hopefully the last 12 days will have taught them that if they put another foot wrong, Israel can come across. And don't forget, as well as the sort of glass ceiling was broken from the Iranians, also the fear on the side of Israel, because we always were led to believe this would be, a very destructive, this could be the war that ends all wars, this could be, the one that kills thousands, tens of thousands of Israelis. Israel has now realized that it can fly across to Iran, flying further than any Israeli Air Force has ever flown in its history, and able basically to take out whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted, over Iran. So I'm sure there'll be some elements within the regime that will understand it. So it remains to be seen which elements within the regime will win out. Will it be that fanatical, obsessive wing, or the slightly more pragmatic? But again, we can only tell with the passage of time.
Great. Thank you very much, Ashley. Now we're just about out of time here. I will end with a comment here from Mitch, who says, "Thank God your audio engineer is not in charge of Rising Lion." To which I wholeheartedly agree. If I was in charge of Operation Rising Lion, Iran would probably have developed an arsenal of nuclear weapons by now. Again, we apologize for the audio on this broadcast. If you stay tuned, in the next few hours, I will be downloading this video, editing it, and fixing the audio. You'll be able to find it on our YouTube channel and across our social media. But for now, I want to thank you again, Ashley, for taking the time to join us and update us this week.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, please join us on Friday for our forum roundtable discussion hosted by Lori Regan on the subject of Israel and the United States relations. We thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.